Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Resilient Rehab Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Zephyr. Today we're going to do a quick podcast episode on hypermobility. I just put my baby to sleep, so I don't have a lot of time. So when she starts crying, I have to run. So we're going to keep this short and sweet. But I got this question from my Evolve Biomechanics mentorship group. Someone was asking about hypermobility and how it impacts assessment, but more specifically, how we can start to look at assessment differently with somebody's hypermobility or with somebody who has hypermobility, and what hypermobility really is. Of course, there is a type of hypermobility that I'm not going to be discussing, and that really has to do with women who are pregnant have changing hormones, and that's going to influence tissue elasticity. We also have different disorders that are also going to influence it. I'm not going to be talking about those. I'm going to be talking about more with the more common type of hypermobility you may see, and those are the people who are based or are biased in this externally rotated position. So everything is externally rotated. They don't have any internal rotation. But when you assess them, it appears that they have a lot of mobility. They have an excessive amount of mobility. So how does that happen? Well, let's just say you have a rounded shoulder and I lay you on your back. You're going to see if I look at you from the side, you're going to see that your upper back is not in contact with the ground. So now when I get you to flex your shoulder overhead, you start to roll back on that space that's not on the ground. And then it appears that you have a ton of mobility that you otherwise don't. And so what tends to happen is we just orient and we start to roll on the table and we start to orient backwards or forwards as we move. And these people have center gravities that are so far forward. We've got the knees that are hyperextended. We've got the pelvis that is dumping forward. And potentially we've got the pelvis that is going so far forward that the tissues in the front and back actually posterior tilt the pelvis to make it look like it's a little bit sway back. So we've maxed out on the constraints in the front of our hip and the front of our shoulder, like our ligaments and stuff like that are going to maintain the stability of the joint, that we end up by just orienting the pelvis again, which is going to further influence the range of motion at our hips and our shoulder. I should say pelvis and rib cage, because it's going to be pelvis and it's going to be hips and the shoulder. When I'm assessing people looking at straight leg raise and hip flexion, hip internal rotation, external rotation, you're going to see crazy numbers. It's going to appear that they have a lot more than they do. However, when you start to look at the axial skeleton, which if you just look this up online, it's just your skull, your rib cage, your spine, and your sacrum. If you do measurements that are going to impact those and take a look at those, you're going to see they're very restricted. Why is it that people who have hypermobility have very limited neck mobility? They have the stiffest necks. They can't turn their neck side to side. They can't side bend their neck looking up and down. They barely have anything. Even doing some type of side lying hip extension, they don't have a lot of hip extension. Or they do a thoracic rotation. That's also going to be very limited because that is going to be testing their axial skeleton. What these people will do is they will compress their axial skeleton, their rib cage, and their spine and their sacrum. They're going to compress that and they're going to push everything forward. And so now the appendicular skeleton, which think of the arms and the legs, well, that's going to appear to be excessive. But that's only because of a position issue. So hypermobility is more of a position issue and a pressure issue. I talked about in one of my previous podcast episodes about how position dictates function and how the pressure within our system is going to influence force production and force acceptance. These are people who cannot pressurize, which means these people cannot internally rotate. You take somebody who has hypermobility and you hold them into a split squat in and around the range where internal rotation and internal pelvic pressure is the most. Think of like 90 degrees of hip flexion and knee flexion. You get them to hold that position. It is very difficult. You get them to do any type of overcoming isometrics. It's very hard for them because that requires a lot of pressure to be created. And that requires a lot of overcoming type connective tissue activity. versus them, they just want to yield all the time. These people will have very floppy joints. As they bend over to touch their toes, there's no rounding or there's no flexion in the spine. They just look like they're folding over. They can bring their chest all the way to their thighs. Not everybody, but some. And so you see that doesn't tell me they have motion. They can bring their leg in a straight leg raise. They can bring their leg and hug it to their shoulder. Again, that doesn't tell me that they've got motion. That just tells me that they're very good at compensating. They're very good at rolling their joints. They're very good at excessively elongating tissues because they're already there. The joint, the femur, is not in a position to be able to express all that motion. So how are they doing that? As you bring their leg overhead, or as you bring their leg towards their shoulder, they start to roll their pelvis towards that side. And that is going to turn their socket out towards the side, which is more external rotation. It's like somebody who's walking and they just, as they hit the ground with their heel, when they should roll onto the inside part of their foot, they just stay on the outside part of their foot the entire time. They can get around perfectly fine. And those are the people that are potentially going to have more mobility, this higher arch. But even people who have hypermobility will have a collapsed arch just because, again, they push their center of gravity so far forward, they don't have any control. They don't have the ability to produce force. So they push their weight towards their toes so they can get off the ground really quickly. So when we're assessing these type of people, we need to consider that our assessment measurements are probably going to be fake. We need to emphasize axial skeleton motion because that's going to tell us how they're moving, where they're restricted, and what is actually going on underneath the hood. And then we need to favor exercises that are going to focus more on overcoming. We need to slow down the concentric phase. Instead of doing long eccentrics, forget about that. They're too good at that. Let's focus on starting them at the bottom, holding the isometric position, and then doing a slow concentric. So these isometric, concentric type of exercises. I personally like to do 1 second down, 2 seconds at the bottom, 3 to 4 seconds up. Watch how hard that is for them because you are delaying that overcoming phase and you are forcing them to pressurize the areas they need to do. And I can use other constraints like elevating their toes so I can further bias this internal rotation. I can get them to do crossover step-ups, right? I can get them to do exercises where these Jefferson type of split squats that force them only in that concentric range. So emphasizing axial skeleton assessment, emphasizing concentric overcoming type actions, as well as isometric, you're going to start to see the changes. They're going to start to feel more stable. These are people who don't have a lot of stability, which to me, stability just means they don't have the ability to pressurize themselves very well. So if you could teach them how to jump from a non-counter movement jump perspective, teach them how to hold positions for longer, teach them how to stand up and ascend longer, you're going to start to see great changes with them. They're going to feel better, they're going to move better, and they're going to start to shift their center of gravity back. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that was helpful. Again, it's hard to kind of go over these concepts in a lot of detail without presenting some type of case study. So if that's something you're interested in, we do a lot of that in our Evolve Biomechanics mentorship. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.